Welcome to our Living Stones podcast, where we gather to discuss all matters of faith and life as members of God's household. In a world that often leaves us feeling fragmented and disconnected, our hope is that Living Stones will help to further connect us as we pursue the Lord together. I'm your host, Xiang, and in today's podcast, we'll be addressing the topic of financial stewardship as followers of Christ. And today, I want to thank Elder Wooch, first-time guest, as well as Pastor Paul for joining us in the discussion today. Welcome, Wooch.
Yes, thank you for having me. I've been an avid consumer of everyone's podcasts, and Mina and I have really enjoyed the podcast thus far, and it's really a joy to be on the podcast.
Yeah, what was your favorite topic so far?
Oh, there are many. Actually, the cult one was really interesting.
Oh, really?
That was interesting. I've enjoyed all the Pastor's Grace stories, and it's interesting. Like, we think we know our pastors, but we really don't. So
You have no idea.
no, seriously.
Unfortunately, the one that I recorded has to be re-recorded, so you have to wait for that one. Yeah, it
All 2
audio
hours.
didn't quite work out, but
Just go on. But yeah, good to have you guys here today. And I think this is a very relevant and also a very important topic because when we talk about finances, that is a very important part of many people's lives. Our livelihood depends on our finances, and many people worry about finances. Finances kind of drive a lot of our culture, society, and our personal lives. So I think this will be a great discussion. But before we get into the meat of things, I wanted to ask, why is this topic of financial stewardship important for us, especially as believers, to talk about in a podcast like this? Why is this topic so important for us?
Yeah, let me start us off and share a couple points and some thoughts. I think it goes without saying, first of all, that money for the average person it encompasses such a big part of their life, and it really informs. I mean, our relationship with money drives a lot of daily decision making, and so that alone plays such a big part and makes it an important topic. And if you think about it, I kind of think of it this way: if you think about for the average Christian, I feel like two of the biggest things, two of the biggest alluring idols that Satan uses to really distract a Christian or to damage our relationship with the Lord really is, I hope I'm not overstating this, but money and sex. And these are two topics that, I'm not specifically talking about our church in general, but in general, the church does not address often enough, I think. And so the discussion needs to be had because every day, I mean, the world has plenty to say about how we ought to relate to these two things, money and sex. And yet, I think for a lot of our listeners, there are probably many well-meaning people who desire to honor the Lord in how they handle their finances, and yet they're kind of trudging along and thinking through just on their own what is the right way to honor the Lord. And so to really talk through this topic and unpack it, I think is important. I think another thing is, as we'll get into it, but this topic of stewardship, sometimes I think of this word as a word that it's kind of been commandeered by Christians. It's not like as much of a Christian word as, say, like sanctification, but stewardship is a foreign word to the world because in this kind of first world country, in the first world setting, stewardship is a very foreign term, right? It's more about ownership, and so for a Christian, I think if you ask an average Christian, what does stewardship mean? They can give you a definition. It means kind of like managing something, right, wisely. But functionally speaking, I don't think it's very much incorporated into the identity of a Christian. And so I think unpacking that is important. And lastly, for me, just more on a personal note, it's from my own reflections as a Christian. I don't know if everyone knows, but my dad is a pastor, so I'm a PK. I've literally been in church all my life. And as I've grown and as I married early, and as I've had to think through how to manage my own household finances and being a Christian, I knew that God wanted me to do something wise or be honoring to Him with finances. I have found that a lot of times I've had to kind of kind of wrestle through this on my own. And so I think the church is the community where this topic needs to be discussed. We need to exhort each other towards what God desires from us. And so I think today, spending some time, I know there are a lot of practical questions we want to ask when we talk about money, but I think really thinking through and unpacking what does the Bible say as a principle about what stewardship is, and thus what financial stewardship is. And I think that's important. And I think we should really talk about that.
Yeah, I think you touched on it briefly about the nature of the word stewardship, right? And I think I do agree that it gets tossed around a lot. But I think for the sake of our listeners, it'd be great for us to define what stewardship means. So what are we talking about? Not just maybe financial stewardship. What does the word stewardship mean, and what are we referring to? Just to clarify and level set.
By the way, I want to thank our elder Uj for actually bringing this topic to our attention, because it is awkward for pastors to speak on, to be honest. And I have dealt with it from the pulpit several times, but every time I do it, it does feel awkward, because people might think, well, why is pastor talking about money again? And seems like the church just wants their money, sort of thing. So yeah, I think this kind of setting this makes it a little easier. It's appropriate. Maybe elders can talk about stewardship more in detail, but just a big picture for me is what helped me the most as a young believer, not just on the topic of finances, but because stewardship is meant to encompass every aspect of life, right? So it all began when I really understood what it meant for Jesus to be Lord, right? So, when you're a young believer, at least my experience was a lot of emphasis was placed on Jesus is my Savior, right? And emphasis on, now I can enjoy life uncondemned because Jesus saved me. But I think the concept of the Lordship of Christ, it took more time for me to understand the implications of that, right? But if you understand that Jesus is Lord, basically King over every area of your life, right? Your intellect, your money, your gender, your sexuality, your time, everything, right? And, we can go on, but once I understood that, I realized, okay, I have to rethink how I handle my money, because God is the owner, right? Jesus is the king over it, and he simply wants me to wisely manage or steward what he has given to me as essentially as a gift, right? So whether it's my finances or whether it's my health, right? My marriage, fatherhood, it's a matter of me taking these resources and essentially leveraging it for God's kingdom purposes, right? How can I use this the best way I can to honor God, to bless people, right? So that's the perspective I've grown to love over time.
Yeah, and that's good, because I think the word Lord itself, right, Kyrios or Kurios, however you want to say it in Greek, that naturally, that the definition of that word is basically an owner or a master, right? So to be under the lordship of Christ and God himself, that immediately assumes that whatever we have is his, because he is the owner of the estate. He is the owner of the property, and we are servants, hired hands to manage what God owns, right? So I think that's one thing that is very clear in stewardship, is we are not the owners. Ownership is not with us.
In an ultimate sense.
A couple things I think about is, I think one good starting point is to say a stewardship is kind of like managing. But as we understand managing in America, it's kind of like we manage someone else's thing and we are compensated for it. So I don't know that is the most complete. Stewardship, maybe, I don't know if this is helpful, but I think of stewardship as managing someone else's interests or possessions as if it is your own, with care. And that is stewardship. And for me, this really, looking at the Bible, to me, stewardship shows up at the very beginning in the creation account when God creates the world and He essentially ordains or commissions Adam to have dominion over the earth,
Mhm.
right? And he ordains work, he ordains all these things. But essentially, when we look at God and we say God is creator and author, ownership is naturally bestowed to him,
Mhm.
meaning he owns everything, right? And so naturally, as created people, we are just custodians. That's the logical kind of
Yeah.
overflow. And so first thing to really grasp, I think, when we think about stewardship is understanding that God is owner of all things and we are merely custodians of all things. And I know that seems really no duh, but you know, actually in my discipleship group, we're going over a book that talks about financial stewardship and one feedback that was valuable to me, and I think I can see why one feedback was that when I think of the word stewardship, I actually only relate it to finances, like financial stewardship, and that was kind of a revelation to me because that again earlier I said stewardship is like a Christian term in some
Mhm.
ways,
Mhm.
but a lot of people think stewardship applies only to finances. But we have to kind of unpack a little deeper and say no, stewardship when God calls us to stewardship, it's over all things He has entrusted to us here in this physical world.
Mhm.
And so I think that is a concept that's so simple but so important. And as we talk more about the specific of finances, I would urge all of us to really ask ourselves, how do we functionally view all that we have?
Mhm.
Money, possessions, our gifts, our authority. Like for whatever reason, the church elected me an elder, and um, I kind of look at that as I have to steward that role for however long I'm asked to serve, and that is really changes the way I view kind of
Mhm.
my role. And so in all things, another big one that I know we don't have time to unpack is like even as parents, we
Mhm.
are stewards over our children, and we can say we understand that, but I don't know if we functionally identify
Mhm.
that way. So again, just really understanding that God is owner and we're a manager. That's really important.
Yeah, giving us some ideas for future topics. It's, it's
It's good though. Well said.
yeah,
Appreciate that.
yeah, and so yeah, no, thanks guys for providing some in-depth definition and kind of level setting what we're talking about when we say stewardship. And so I think obviously the main topic for us today is stewardship specifically in the financial aspect of our lives, right? With what do we do with our finances? What does it mean to steward our finances for the Lord, right? That's the essence of the topic today. And so, naturally the question is, what does the Bible have to say about managing our finances, right? What is the biblical principle or the biblical view of money and how we ought to handle our finances?
Yeah, let me present two things that I think are helpful, and I don't know if this necessarily directly answers your question, but I think it's all under the umbrella of stewardship. But
Mm-hmm.
we talked about number one, it's important to view ourselves as custodians. I like the word custodian a little better than manager, even though I think NIV translation of a lot of these parables are like manager, right?
Mm-hmm.
But manager's okay too. Manager versus owner
Yeah.
view. But another thing that is helpful to me, and I hope it is helpful to those of us in our church, is one linchpin maybe parable is parable of the talents. We always talk about that when we talk about money and talent. It's funny because talent in the English word also means like skill, and that's applicable because it's stewarding your skill that applies. But I know in this specific parable, talent is a great sum of money.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a bunch of denarii. I think I did some research, and like one talent is like 20 years worth of wages, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in this point, it's there's these differentiations made where the owner or the master gives these three managers a different amount, right? And the reason why I bring that up is another helpful point for us is I think we also need to understand that depending on who we are and what stage of life we are in, God asks us to steward a different amount. Or what's a better way to put it? I think what is helpful is to ask yourself, what is God asking me to steward at this time? And that will differ from person to person, and also will differ based on the stage of life that you are in.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many concepts about if you are faithful with a little, God gives you more, right? But all this to say, the reason why I bring this up is because I think one thing that is a struggle in Nova is like, not to go too tangent, but like in Nova, we have kind of a formulaic, maybe this is an extension of the Nova
Pros and
podcast.
cons of Nova.
Yeah, pros and cons of Nova. But you know what I mean? Like, there's a formulaic way that we kind of like, we go to college, we get our degree, we find that Pastor Paul says IT and government job, right?
Consulting.
Yeah, we value family, so we get married. Maybe we start off with a condo in town. These are all generalizations.
Sure,
I don't
sure.
want people to take it that way. And then we buy either a Odyssey or a Sienna, or if you're really a rebel, you buy like a Pacifica, right? I have not seen anything else at our church. But all this to say, like, it's very our lives are very comparable,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's a struggle because if we make financial decisions as if we are the 5-talent person, when just to be blunt, like at this point in our life, maybe what God is asking us to steward and what we have before us in terms of resources is the 2-talent, so to speak. I think that leads to overextension. That, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't lead to wide decision making. And so, just this I think this helps also in the unity of the church. Is just ask yourself, what is God asking me to steward well at this time? So, I think that's a point that has helped me, right? And being content, like humbly being honest with the fact that, okay, this is what God is asking me to steward at this time, and how do I do that well?
Yeah.
And so that's a point that I think is also important.
I think all we can really do as believers is to derive these true principles that we can learn from Scripture, because let's be honest, the Bible doesn't lay out systematically how we ought to view money, but it does offer these timeless principles, right? These truths that we can say that are wise and rooted in God's character. I think one thing that's pretty clear to me, and if you've ever studied Acts, the early church, you see those who have more. Okay, we see a picture of them generously giving to those who were in need. Okay, and some people abuse that, and they make it sound as if it was some kind of like giving that was mandated or forced, but it's not true. It was voluntary giving. And so one principle we derive from that is sometimes, right, God gives you excess, right, so that you can help those who are in need, right, who don't have enough.
Yeah.
I think that's a true principle that everyone should be able to say, yes, that, of course, And so that would be an expression of generosity and really just loving and caring for those around you. Again, it's not compulsory giving; it's voluntary giving that is mentioned there. Another principle, I believe, that we can clearly see, it mainly comes through to us from the wisdom sayings.
Yeah.
But the principle would be wealth building is actually very wise, right? It's wise to have a plan, right? To save. Not in any greedy way, but to have some strategy as to how you want to, again, steward your resources, right? So that perhaps you can have enough to help others in the future, right? So that you can invest in something that could create jobs and give people, an opportunity, right? And so I think you can't get to that point unless you have a plan to accumulate wealth, and invest in it wisely. But, for our maybe listeners, I look back at some of the teachings I've done in the past, and that's one principle that popped out to me. But a few sayings from the Proverbs: wealth gained hastily will dwindle, but whoever gathers little by little will increase it. Right? So the assumption there is we are going to over time save if you're wise about it, right? The crown of the wise is their wealth. Okay, in other words, if you're wise.
Yeah.
If you're wise, chances are you will be able to accumulate a good amount of wealth throughout your lifetime, right? the plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance. Okay, so some principles there that straight up from the Proverbs, right?
Mm.
Proverbs 13, 14, 21, right?
Mm.
Just to give a few.
Yeah, I really like that. I want to share it because I think it's relevant also to what Pastor Paul says. There's this quote, I don't even know where I read it, but it goes like this, and I like it because it speaks to the two natures of how we, I think, should relate to money. But it goes like this. It says, you should have a healthy fear of money, but you should also have a very noble vision of how to use money to advance God's kingdom.
Mm.
And I love that because it talks both to the nature of how we, everyone loves to quote Timothy and says, the love of money is the root of a lot of evil. And it is true. Money can be such an idol because it represents power, it represents security, it represents so many things. And so much like sex, we take these two things and we're very cavalier about it. Like we get very close to it. Like, especially in this culture, it's like we're so desensitized to certain things and we're just like, but there ought to be a certain level of like trembling when you steward these. You're like, oh man, I have to do a good job. I got to really think this through, right? And I love that. But here, I like what Pastor Paul shared because as Nova Christians, I really think this, right? Man, like sometimes I have this thought, like I'm like, when God calls us to account, both personally and as a church, he's going to be like, I gave you guys 5 talents. What did you do with that? Right. And it's not an overstatement to say, I know we're not like the most affluent church in the area, but it's not an overstatement to say many of our members have been given a lot. And so I think it is right to say, encourage what is our noble vision for creating capital, and what is encompassed in all that is ingenuity, is taking risks, is working hard, is really assessing what your talents are, to including to build wealth and to save. That is wise. That is shrewd, and that's another parable I love. But ultimately, it has to be a noble vision for God's kingdom because we come into this world naked and we take nothing from it. So it's what are you building into treasures in heaven? So that's a quote I always go back to myself to kind of think about. Okay, where am I?
Yeah. Yeah, I think these points are, at least for me, hearing as a listener, these points are really good. And I think it helps a lot of people because I do think that money and finances are kind of like somewhat of a taboo when it comes to its compatibility with the Christian life. I think sometimes people, kind of view accumulation of wealth and what the concept of wealth building as perhaps worldly in some sense. I think there's a bit of a stigma because you see like Wolf of Wall Street and all these sort of like super wealthy billionaires and millionaires who live their lives very lavishly and things. So it's kind of like, oh, but as Christians, I thought we blessed are those who don't have much. Blessed are the poor. That kind of mindset, or even like, hey, weren't Christians, like they gave up everything and lived like in a very simple like ascetic life where you just retreat into like some place and and money is not really a thing in your life anymore and things like that. So I think
and sorry to cut you off, but I totally understand though why most Christians, especially young Christians who, in my mind, if I look back at my Christian walk, I feel like in some sense I had this purity about me, and you have this vision of life that is not preoccupied with money, and also there is that verse, right? It doesn't go, money is the root of all evil, but it's love of money is the root of all evil. But even that, right? If you think about what that's saying, and then you look to yourself, how deceitful your heart is. And I think this is what I had to wrestle with as a young believer. Like there was a fear of money because I knew myself. I knew how prone to wander my heart was and how attractive money could be. And so, I think most Christians, if I observe, they begin with that fear of money,
Mm.
and it does lead them to, I think, struggle a bit in the financial sense
Yeah.
initially, at least, until they maybe adopt a little more mature
Yeah.
perspective.
Mm.
Yeah.
But I totally understand
Yeah.
why Christians would wrestle with
Absolutely.
that.
Yeah, I would say that in some ways is a false spirituality, like asceticism,
Mhm.
like there's some parallels to the purity culture, right? Like I keep using money and sex because I think there's so many parallels here. But
Mhm.
like one of the, in retrospect, the fall, kind of the, what do you want to call it? The negative fruits of purity culture is like, in an attempt to be holy, we kind of have put sex kind of far away and
Mhm.
almost made it a taboo.
Mhm.
And yet, what happens when you get married then, right? And sex was designed by God for it to be a good thing. It was just robbed. It was just
Mhm.
essentially Satan took it,
Yeah.
and so, like Pastor Paul said, the love of money is a root. So
Mhm.
maybe we can assign money as amoral. So my point earlier is, as Nova Christians, I actually think good stewardship is taking money and asking ourselves, how do we advance God's kingdom
Yeah.
with this? That's the question we need to ask. And so, rather than adopting a false spirituality, it's hard, and that's why I like that quote of having a healthy fear of money.
Mhm.
That is why this discussion in discipleship groups and CGs are important, to be like, oh, maybe I have been short sighted,
Yeah.
right? Where, and asking your brother, like, like, what is your vision? Like, it's great that your 401k looks great, but what is your ultimate goal, right?
Mhm.
Kind of thing, and challenging ourselves. So that's why I think it is important. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's good because I feel like, a lot of, like you said, a lot of people in Northern Virginia, because of the opportunities and just the area that we have been greatly blessed, at least in a financial sense.
No, I like what Elder Uj says about the need to have a healthy fear of money. And like I said before, I understand why many Christians, at least early on in their walk, would have some concerns over wealth building,
Yeah.
right? I think if I forgot who it was, but there were a few categories that helped me sort of sort through this dilemma, and it was righteous wealth. I think it was, well, actually righteous rich. I think the guy used
Yeah.
like
I remember you
unrighteous
saying
rich,
this.
righteous poor, and unrighteous poor. In other words, like there is such a thing as unrighteous poor as well, meaning like, poverty is not necessarily a godly thing.
Mhm.
You could be poor simply because you are sinfully lazy, right?
Yeah.
And so let's not glamorize poverty just for the sake of poverty.
Right.
And same thing applies to riches as well. You can have righteous wealth, but you can also have unrighteous wealth,
Mhm.
right? God can basically Abraham you and make you really wealthy. And he could also, as one author put it, Job you, right? He can strip you of all that wealth. Not and it's not your fault. And like you're not.
I like that.
It's just the circumstances of life. It happens, right? Sometimes you have no control. But again, I just want our audience to know that there is such a thing as righteous, unrighteous, righteous. Whether it's wealth or poverty.
Yeah, yeah. And I think what my point was that those clarifications are really, really helpful because, some people have a hard time like knowing what to feel about their wealth and the blessings that they've been given. And so to know that there is a righteous aspect to it and also an unrighteous aspect to it, that I think that's a good point of clarification to not, stigmatize anything, but also at the same time cultivating what we're talking about, like a
Yeah.
healthy fear, right?
Yeah. The person who decides to abandon this way of life and go to a foreign mission field and not live a wealthy lifestyle,
Mhm.
that's righteous poor,
Mm.
and that's a great way to live too.
Mm.
But again, we want to make those distinctions clear.
Yeah, that's good. I like that.
One time I was actually talking about this topic to my kids, right? And I used this illustration. I said, yeah, in an ultimate sense, God ordains what we have. He makes us Abraham, or I just learned you can Job us. And I kind of have this illustration. I kind of like, I'm not a chef by any means, but it's kind of like I use this with my kids. I just made it up on the spot. I said, God has given us his best fruits and his best ingredients. And he says, prepare a banqueting table for me. Okay. And out of my love for my dad or our father, we go in the kitchen and we labor and we work hard and we create this big banquet. And God looks at us, or our father looks at us and says, you eat, right? And it's because the reason why I say that is because I've sometimes asked myself, God, why is certain things going so well in my life? Like, you know what I mean? Like, why do I have so much privilege? And I just came back from vacation with my family, and sometimes I used to wrestle with that, struggle with that, and I think, the only thing I've reasoned myself is, with gratitude, we return it back to the owner, to the giver, and we say, thank you, Lord. And God says to us, then eat until you have your fill, and then give to those around you. You know what I mean? Like, look for the next person to eat at my banqueting table. And I kind of use that to my kids. I hope it resonated, but I kind of think of it that way, that, like, sometimes I don't know why we have what we have, but what our job is to do is to be righteous rich, if that's how we view ourselves. Ultimately, to ask ourselves, how do we steward what we have well?
Mm.
I'll ask Jordan next time if he remembers.
If he has no recollection, then I was pouring out my heart. And,
No, I like that point. That's you're preaching there. I like that.
yes, another thing that I would like to bring up, and it's for your guys' input and just thought I had, a biblical principle that thing is helpful when we think about stewardship is also, or a theological point that is helpful or important when we examine how to steward things well, is also to think about, what do we believe about our eschatology? And I normally don't use big words like that, but you guys
Whoa.
throw that kind of stuff around all the time, so I
I
prepare.
like it.
Okay.
I've
But
never
to
said
me,
that.
to me, more specifically, because it could be like end times, study of end times. But for me, more specifically, what I mean by eschatology is, how do we view heaven, and ultimately, how do you view our ultimate hope? Like, when we're in glory, like, what does that mean to us, right? And in some ways, like, I was like this for a long time. I never thought about what heaven is, right? Really. Like, it's just kind of a lot of people, I don't want to overgeneralize. Some people, heaven is very immaterial, very like spirit world, very like, it has no relation to the earth. But that's actually not what the Bible teaches. And the way I like to explain it so it sinks in is, any good thing that I've ever tasted in this world, right? Like, it is a foreshadowing of the ultimate culmination that is heaven, right? So the things that we long for here on earth, this is important because it will decide what we invest into, where we choose to put our treasures in, right? So if we have no ultimate view of hope, of heaven, then of course this here and now is what's ultimate for us, right? And we invest into that, knowing that ultimately it will come to an end at some point. But the Bible says, store up for yourself treasures in heaven. And we go, okay, that's noble. That's probably what God wants us to do. But if we view that as, no, that is our ultimate hope, and it is infinitely better to do so, then it will drive our motivation for good stewardship. And so eschatology is important. And one other thing I wanted to say is, like, a couple of years ago, we had a retreat, and we had Pastor Francis Chang. He came and he talked about.
Wait, let's clarify for the audience. Not Francis Chan.
No.
But Francis Chang. The
Francis Chang, even better. And his whole theme that retreat was about being a sojourner. That's also a really foreign word to the average
That's his church name, by the way. So.
Oh, it is? Oh, so it's very fitting that you would speak on this, right? But the point about sojourning is simple. It's that we view ourselves as, this is our temporary home. We're passing through and we're on mission here, but our ultimate home is in heaven, right? And it's really hard for us to view ourselves as sojourners, and kind of bringing back the Nova podcast. It's like, in some ways, Nova is very alluring, right? Like, it invites us to place our securities, place our hopes here on the here and now, right? And so to view ourselves as sojourners, and to really ask ourselves, what is heaven, and why do I want to store my treasures in heaven, is also, I think, really important. And, so theology matters.
Yeah, it does, because, like, when we think about eschatology, we think about, like, prosperity gospel and even some extreme versions of the charismatic movement. what they're looking for is heavenly blessings now, right? Heavenly treasures,
Mm.
God's blessings now. And we define that as over realized eschatology,
Mm.
as in you focus too much on the heavenly blessings here now on earth that that sort of ignores all of the sojourning where we're citizens of heaven, not of earth. And we are here and already but not yet, in the sense that, like, we are God's people, God's redeemed people, and yet he is still coming for us, right? In the end, when Christ
Yeah,
returns.
and they have no real way to explain righteous poor.
Yeah. Yeah. Like,
There's no such thing as
because,
righteousness
like,
and prosperity gospel.
because
Well,
your faith equals
Yeah.
your blessings,
Yep.
right? So if you equate that, it's like, if you don't have enough faith, then that's
yeah,
the
it's your fault you didn't pray hard enough.
yeah. Obviously we're saying that very pejoratively, but that's what it is. Like, in a sense, it's you're asking for too much that was not intended, that God did not intend for you
Mhm.
here on earth. And so I do think that perspective matters, like
Yeah.
how you view, your journey here on earth and where you're headed, right? Like, what is your ultimate destination?
And correct me if I'm wrong. Aren't a lot of like the parables of like finances? It's like what's the correct term? Like eschatological.
Eschatological.
Yeah, is that what it is? Like when I was studying for this, like the parable of the talents, parable of the dishonest manager or shrewd manager. Like, it's kind of fits in with the Gospels that talks about it was like Jesus's final teaching. I'm gonna leave,
Yeah,
and I'm gonna come back, and I'm gonna ask you
Yeah.
what you did.
there's a continuity between the present we're living in and the future that will come, right? And so basically what we do here on earth, it matters
Yeah.
greatly
Yes.
to God. That's
Yes.
the whole point, right?
Yep.
Based on how you stewarded your talents now, based on that, here I will give you much more
Yeah.
to look over, to manage, right? And bless you with this much more. So
Yeah.
that's the logic there. So
And would you say, like, the gospel, Ephesians 2, like, we are saved by grace through faith. And I'm not saying, there's an overreaction sometimes of like, we're not saved by our works, but that order of we are saved by grace through faith to do good works
Mhm.
is very important. And there's all of these parables about God calling us to account talks about it. Oh, based on what you do, I will reward you.
Yeah.
And even the Apostle Paul talks about a crown that is given to us, right? And so I think that's also an important point when we talk about stewardship and, like, like back to the point, some of us as Christians were like, what should we do with our money? And many times we become that manager who buries our one talent in the ground.
out of
Mm.
fear, yeah.
Yeah, out of fear of making a mistake or being corrupted, whatever the case may be.
Mm.
And I think that is also something that we need to think through, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
No, for sure. And I think these biblical principles, kind of leads me to ask this question, because I think for a lot of our listeners who attend church, this is going to be very relevant. What does the Bible say about giving to the church, right? So, if you attend our service, you know that there is a 2 minute, or not even 2 minute, a 1 minute window where we have time for tithes and offering as part of our worship service, right? That is part of our worship. But can you guys sort of, expound on where that idea comes from, tithing and giving offering to the church? Can we flesh that out a little bit here?
Oh boy. Here we go. Talk about money again. And yeah, once I get to tithing, that's when people start rolling their eyes, I think. But I mean, the principle of tithing was instituted in the Old Testament, right? It was a way for God to provide for his people, like specifically for the priestly tribe, right?
Levites.
The Levites. And so all the other tribes were meant to be gainfully employed and essentially give over 10% roughly. I know the math gets a little complicated if you get into all the nitty-gritty details, but just for simplicity's sake, 10% of what they had, they gave it to the tribe of Levi so that the priests could focus on their duties
Right.
and not be preoccupied with, quote unquote, worldly affairs. And so, I guess the question is, does that principle directly apply to the new covenant era?
Mhm.
Because we're talking about old covenant
Yep.
systems, right, and structures versus what we're under now, the new covenant. And I made the case to our people several times that the new covenant is actually a more generous covenant, right? Because
Mhm.
uh, if you think about what Jesus offered, right, he didn't offer us 10%; he offered his entirety.
Mhm.
And so there is a greater generosity uh, exhibited within the new covenant that we are under as God's people. And so, if that's the case, the conclusion I made was essentially, for us, 10% should be bare minimum,
Mhm.
right? We don't mandate it. We don't act like we're under, like, if you don't tithe, we're gonna kind of go after you kind of thing.
Yeah.
But we highly encourage people to consider 10% as bare minimum, and if you're able to, work toward giving more over time,
Mm.
right? So that's sort of the posture I've taken, and I think that's for the most part correct.
Mm.
And we gave examples of people who have worked toward what was called reverse tithing, right? So they would seek to live off of 10% and give 90% of what they own, like
Wow.
the super wealthy, let's say, right? People or even pastors living off royalties, right? So,
Right. Right.
and who don't need salary from their churches, right?
Yeah.
There are such people. They live off 10%, they give away 90%. So that's a radical example, but just I think if we had the discipline to cap our lifestyle,
Mm.
I think moving beyond 10% is definitely doable over time.
Mm.
We have our two pastors here, and now even Pastor Xiang is fully supported by our church.
Thank you, church.
Hey, that's a fruit of everyone's generosity. But maybe I'll use this card. I'm in the shoe of many of our listeners. I've worked in corporate America. I have a vocational 9 to 5,
Mm.
and I have also had to wrestle through this aspect of what is tithing. And of course, there have been many seasons of my life where I would say that tithing, I didn't really ask myself, how important is that? It was always present in my life because even my parents instilled that in me. Couple thoughts come to mind, and I think actually recently I've been reading through the Old Testament, and so it was interesting to see, like, okay, the tribe of Levi, they take care of the tabernacle, and they're in charge of the priestly duties of things. And so today it's interesting. I don't know if this will come through, but Pastor Paul talked about how we are the tabernacle, and so as pastors, they're in charge of maintaining our hearts, right, spiritually speaking, and all that. But I guess what I wanted to say is, this verse comes to mind, is that Jesus didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And so there's much wisdom still to be gained by these
Yeah.
these practices in the Old Testament. And so one thing that comes to mind is, a lot of times if we read through the Old Testament, it says that they were instructed to give. They have these strict protocols about like good calf and good meat, and you're instructed to give the first fruits.
Mhm.
Right? The first fruits, and that's an application point that can easily be applied, and that I have not always applied in my life. But to me, from a practical sense, what that means is, later we'll talk about budgeting, but when you budget, perhaps instead of asking yourself what's left over, and then I'll tithe that,
Mm.
first you give to the Lord minimum of what is His, and then your budget should follow thereafter, right? And I think even with budgeting, it's hard to kind of keep up in Nova, right? And and I think it's easy to not have tithing as a practical aspect within your budget.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I don't know if we should get into the whole budget thing, but me, I have a certain kind of like I think it's okay to use worldly wisdom in some ways of how to practically budget, but you'll always understand that worldly budgets will never include charity and tithing and giving to the Lord because that's a foreign concept to them. As a Christian, you have to take what the world gives us, and there are many good things. Like there's one that I use, and it goes like this. It says 50, 30, 20. So 50% to your fixed needs, things that, you need, right? And even that's debatable, like your housing, your food. 30% to your wants, which is actually a pretty generous amount. And then the world says 20% to savings, right? Save for your future. So there's this wisdom. And you can only exercise this if you're not in debt, if you are in control of your budget, right? But as a Christian, what I'm saying is, as I've kind of thought through this, I'm like, I have to reorient kind of my budgeting. First, you have to give to the Lord what is His, and then that will then give you the percentages of what is fixed income. And something like housing, right? It's really such a large expense, and it's a great thing to be able to provide for your family a home, but we can't have all things, is what I'm saying.
Right.
Yeah.
So I know I went on a tangent there, but those are some things I think about with tithing.
Yeah.
No, I do think tithing is meant to carry with it these spiritual benefits for sure, because I mean the act of tithing, if you think about what it does to your heart, it immediately reinforces the idea that, again, like what we said before, God is the owner of my money and
Yeah.
I'm merely a steward.
Yep.
And so here's one way, like one of the primary ways in which I express that reality. It's through tithing. And it also immediately prevents you from trying to chase after your peers and keep up with their lifestyle, because you're not supposed to, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And I think the heart behind tithing is ultimately say, Lord, what I have is yours, given to me by you, out of the abundance of your grace and the blessings that you bestow upon me. It's that kind of an expression.
Right. Each time you tithe, it orients your heart.
Yeah.
To like, God, you're the ultimate provider.
honestly, it hurts every time.
I did some research, and I thought this was very interesting, and I think this was from Christianity.com or whatever. But they did a poll or a survey on tithers, and I think there's something to be gleaned here. I'm not going to go into all of it, but essentially it goes like this. It says the research found that tithers, when compared to non-tithers, they were better off financially speaking. Actually, in the sense that like 80% of tithers had no credit card bills, like unpaid credit card bills. 74% don't even owe, like aren't in big debt, like they don't own things for their cars. 48% own their homes, and 30% are totally debt free, right? And I think what this is saying is not that if you tithe you're going to be well off,
Right.
but if you tithe, you understand your relationship with money.
Yeah.
So you know how to not overextend yourself.
Right.
You know how not to chase that kind of like carrot in the sky, and you are more content with what you have, right?
Yeah.
And this goes to kind of the principle of ultimately when we follow the wisdom of the Lord, when we follow the gospel, it leads to our personal flourishing. And I think, so much of our relationship with tithing is like, Pastor Paul joked about it, and I completely agree, because there's some months where I'm just like, oh my gosh, like I was a bad money manager, like, right? But ultimately, you got to tell yourself, when I give to the Lord what is His, and I orient my heart in this way, it is for my benefit, and I have like less of a grip. Like money has a less of a grip on me, and I have more freedom. Just you have to tell yourself that, and that is the truth, right? Whether we accept it or not.
Yeah.
When you tell yourself, I can't give because I have X, Y, and Z, what is the ultimate fruit? You're in stress, right? You're trying to keep up. You're trying to pay for that. Maybe this is not anyone in specific, but like that high car payment, right?
Yeah.
And it brings a lot of stress.
Apple Vision Pro,
How much is that?
3,000 plus.
Oh my!
Wait, is it really?
Yeah.
Wow.
It's
Oh
like
my.
3,300.
Why do you know that?
Because Deacon Abe mentioned to me the other day. He was like, "Did you hear about the Vision Pro?" So I looked it up.
I mean, it does look cool though.
Wow, 3,200.
Let's see.
But yeah, that's great. I mean, it forces you essentially to be more disciplined, and it over time changes your character. And guess what? The godlier character you have, the greater discipline you have, you will in the end be blessed.
Yeah.
So blessings do flow from the act of tithing, but it's not like this immediate thing. It's over time, where as your character changes and becomes more like Jesus, essentially,
Mhm.
right? Hey, your lifestyle changes, and you kind of, again, you understand how to handle money better, so that's where the blessings come.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one last point I'll make about tithing, since we're on the top subject. As someone who in the last 2 years has had more insight into our church finances, I think I've appreciated the fact that I'm not saying we always can strive to be good stewards. When I say we, I'm talking about the session, the elders, the finance team, those who handle are entrusted, but from our members this amount of money. But I've been able to see firsthand the good that has come through charity to the local church, which is the primary way that we're to exercise our generosity. Not the only way, but the primary way. And whether it's being able to help release mercy funds to help some of our members that most people don't know about, or to be able to continually fund and maybe even go above and beyond with our missionaries, which is kind of essentially our frontline workers, right? In a way, to be. I just want our listeners to know that I think there is a tangible fruit that comes from generosity. That the church's job is to, again, we're going to be called to be give account to this too, and so to just to that bears fruit.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's good. It's consistent with also the Old Testament sort of tithing laws as well. A portion of tithes also went to the poor, and those who are in need, and certainly to support the work of the ministry as well. So, yeah, I think these are really helpful biblical principles, and I think we can kind of summarize it to say that tithing and giving offerings to the Lord ultimately is an act of worship, right? When we say we our lives are to be sacrificed, we're to live as living sacrifices, constantly worshiping the Lord wherever we are and whatever we do. And I think when we give to the Lord, specifically in the form of offering and tithing, that is also an act of worship to the Lord. And so, thank you guys.
Yeah, Elder Uj has been great.
Yeah,
You
wow,
should invite him more often.
yeah, he came ready.
Yeah, he came all prepared. We should prepare more, Pastor Shion. What do you think?
I'm good.
It's you guys like it organic, right?
Yeah, that's the.
I like the preparation too, actually.
No, that's really good. I appreciate it, and yeah, I think we'll continue our discussion in our next episode, and we're gonna dive deep into the practicals of what we just laid out. So stay tuned for that. As we come to the end of this episode of Living Stones, we hope that you've gained a greater understanding and appreciation for God's desire for us as stewards of His blessings. If you found value in today's episode, we encourage you to share it with others. Remember that you are not alone in this journey. We are members of God's household, united by our shared faith in the Lord and the desire to grow together. So until next time, may God's grace and peace be with you all. Thank you for being a part of Living Stones.